Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody is in the right place. This is the Object Strategies webinar focusing on performance. We're going to look at how ModelPort can be used with the ArchiCAD to try to increase the performance of imported objects. My name is Tom Simmons. I am the Business Director and BIM Consultant here at ArchVista Consulting. We're going to look at three primary topics today. The first is how you can improve some of the areas of ArchiCAD that it has difficulty in terms of importing objects, in particular, reviewing objects before import, which is something that is difficult to do within ArchiCAD. We're going to look at how to improve the performance of previews, which if you've got high polygon counts in ArchiCAD, your previews within the object settings can be really sluggish and slow. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how in the model view options can be used to manage detail level. So with imported objects, you don't have model view options within those objects as parameters and as options to manage the detail level. So we're going to look at how that can be done. And we're going to look at how you can use morphs, within ArchiCAD to, with imported objects. But we're also going to look at how morphs can definitely affect performance too, because if you convert a morph or an object to a morph, it becomes clunky and can affect performance. So we'll look at that too. And then we're going to take a look at two particular areas here and how ModelPort can really help you solve some of these problems. So the first will be how we use preview and editing of imported objects within ModelPort, including the preview editor, which is a fantastic way to review objects before you import. We're going to look at the ability to batch import and view multiple models at the same time within that preview editor. We're going to look at a comparison between ModelPort and ArchiCAD and the speed of preview between these two applications, and really look at how ModelPort can help you preview objects before you bring them into ArchiCAD. And then finally, within this section, we're going to look at interactive selection and editing, which is an important part to our preview editor in ModelPort. And then finally, we're going to look at model management and detail level. There's three particular topics we're going to cover in this. The first is how you can reduce polygon count and increase performance. We're going to look at the issue of object file size, because oftentimes imports that you bring into ArchiCAD can be quite large, and we're going to look at ways that you can manage that. And then finally, we're going to look at how you can use model view options with imported objects to manage the detail level. This is something that's not possible within ArchiCAD. With any other application out there that goes at ArchiCAD. This is something that we're just getting ready to release. You guys are going to see a preview of that today. And then finally, we're going to have questions and answers at the end. I want to let everybody know who's new to this. There is a panel in your panel, the webinar, go to webinar control panel there. There's a Q&A section there. Go ahead and enter your questions in. We'll take those questions at the end of the session. So we'll go ahead and get started. So let's first start with the ArchiCAD default object import section. And I want to start first by talking about the difficulty of reviewing objects before import. And this is a great example. This is a Viking stove. Some of you may have this in your home, but this is actually directly from their website. So if you go to the Viking website, and you go to a section for their CAD and BIM downloads and objects, you can actually download a number of different objects from there. And this is a SketchUp one, but of course you've got DXF, you've got 3ds, OBJ, RFA. And this is very common with many manufacturers and many different types of websites out there, where you can actually download a number of different file formats and whatever's going to work best with you. And sometimes what you'll do is you'll download several formats and see which one works best for ArchiCAD, which is a great way of doing it. But of course, if you're going to download a bunch of formats, or formats that are very large like this one, it can take a lot of time to review. And so that's one of the issues. Is this is a 149 megabyte file. It's 795,000 polygons. And just to import into ArchiCAD, just for us to review, before we even know, do we want this to keep this object and use it? It took 2.5 minutes on my Apple Silicon computer, which is a pretty fast computer. It took 4 minutes and 10 seconds on an Apple Intel machine that we have here as well. And depending on the computer you have, it could take 5 minutes, 6 minutes. I mean, complicated big objects and big models can take a while to convert and import into ArchiCAD. And that's to import, to place, and then to preview that object. And so if you think about that, if you've got dozens of objects you've downloaded from a manufacturer website, or even, you've gone to just this one object, you've downloaded a couple different versions of formats here that you want to review, it could take you a lot of time to do that. And so we want to talk today about how we can help solve that problem. Another issue that's quite common, in addition to the fact that a small chair like this can be 106,000 polygons, which is kind of crazy, but nonetheless, you bring in these objects like this, right, and you want to be able to edit them. Well, there's not a lot of editing options here, right? It's a high polygon count object. I bring it up into the object settings here. If it's a very high polygon count object, it can be very slow and sluggish in our ArchiCAD object settings preview window here, which can be very frustrating because you open that object settings up and then it all of a sudden spins and waits and waits and waits while it renders that 3D view of that object. And that can be very frustrating. The other thing that's frustrating is the fact that we just don't have a whole lot that we can edit in terms of the parameters here. We've got rotation, we have scaling, and we have hotspots, and that's it. And so if I want to edit the materials here, if I want to edit, maybe turn off the base or turn off the footstool or something like that, I can't do that. I've got to convert this object to a morph. At that point, which we'll talk about in a second, is a whole other issue. There's also no model view options within imported objects. So if I have an object I've imported from this manufacturer, like a Viking stove or maybe Kohler, this Kohler vanity, it gives me, again, the options to rotate, to scale, and for the hotspots. And that's it. I have no options if I want to reduce the detail level. And that's one of the powers of the model view options in ArchiCAD, is the ability to change and reduce the detail level. So what I really like about that is the fact that, if I've got an object in ArchiCAD and I go to a rendering, I want to see the full detail level. But if I want to go to a document view, I want to see a medium detail level because I don't want to see all that information for that object. And that's a real power to this. And I'll show you how you can do that now in the import objects as well. Now, as I mentioned, you can convert these objects that you bring in to a morph. And that is a real feature in ArchiCAD. In fact, I've done that many, many times with objects, and it can be very, very helpful. In some cases, it actually works beautifully. In other cases, this Kohler sink is a good example. So it was imported using, I think, OBJ or FBX format. Or no, it was I think it was DAE format. And you can see here where, it's very triangulated, lots of polygons to it. It's kind of messy in terms of that because of that polygons and triangulations as part of that object. And as it shows you here, when you right-click it, select it, right-click, and select Convert Selection to Morph, it'll bring up this dialog warning. Basically, it tells you that this is an extremely complex object, and it may affect the performance of ArchiCAD. And that's quite common. The more complex the morph is, or the object is, when it converts to a morph, it's going to slow down ArchiCAD even more. So you have to be really careful of that. Also, once I convert it to a morph, each of those individual planes are difficult to select and difficult to change because of just the nature of the morph and nature of those planes on that surface. And it really depends on why that particular element was created. And it can be really difficult and a challenge to kind of change the surfaces here. So Just things to keep in mind. That's one of the things that I want to talk about today in terms of how you can use the performance in Modelport with its features to kind of help you edit these elements without having to do this. So let's first start with a discussion about our preview editor, so we can preview the objects and also edit the objects within Modelport. So in Modelport, whenever you open an object, or I should say import an object, it's going to bring it into our preview window here, which is what you're seeing right now. Within this preview window, we've got three parts to it. We've got the top window, which will be a 3D view. We've got our floor plan view and an elevation view. Now, each of these windows also can be changed if I wanted to. I could have the top one be the floor plan view and the bottom one be the 3D view, or I could simply show one window as well. I don't have to show all three windows. So it's very easy to transform this Modelport editing environment, a preview window, into a multitude of different types of views. But what's really powerful here is the ability to be able to rotate and move and change, etc., this particular object. I can click on different item lists and see the different materials. I can also click within the 3D window and select elements as well. But what's really powerful about this is, let's say that I had a bunch of objects that I just downloaded from that Viking website, and I wanted to take a look at those before I import them into ArchiCAD. Well, by bringing them into this 3D window, I'm only bringing it into the Modelport environment. When I import it into Modelport, it is not imported into ArchiCAD. It's only sitting in the Modelport environment. In fact, if you look at the very upper left-hand corner of this Modelport window, you'll see a button that says Create. What that means is that it's not yet part of ArchiCAD. It's only sitting temporarily in this Modelport preview. That's the power of it. I can bring this in, very quickly review it, and decide, do I want to import ArchiCAD and create an object, or close it and look at another object. The other thing it really helps with is reducing the clutter in your embedded library. What we see a lot with clients is that, and you probably had this experience as well, you go to a manufacturer website, you go to the 3D warehouse or other types of library sources out there, and you download a bunch of objects. You then go and start importing all those objects into ArchiCAD because you want to review them and you want to see if you're going to use them. And in the end, you may only use 10%, 20%, 30% of those objects. And so you've got all these other objects sitting in your embedded library. And most people don't always go and clean up that embedded library. So you just have a lot of those objects sitting there, which are starting to bloat your file and make your file much larger than it needs to be. And that's the nice thing about Modelport, is that it never brings that into your embedded library because you've never actually created that object. It's sitting there in the preview window as a preview, not going in to ArchiCAD until you decide that you want that. The other important aspect of this is that it allows you to preview multiple models. So the preview editor under the item list there on the right, as you'll see, this is a Lightolier light that's been imported in. There's a couple others here. And if we go down, we can review the Luster model. We can view the sconce, and we view another Luster light model. And then you can begin to move those around. You can edit them. But again, until we've created that create button, or I should say clicked that create button, until we've done that, these are just sitting in the preview environment. So I have multiple objects here. I can kind of go through these. I can decide which ones I want. So again, if I've gone to that Viking site and I've downloaded all those objects, I can just simply bring those in here, and it's very fast to review. It also allows you to do a batch import. So again, let's say you've got all those objects you downloaded. And maybe in this case, I've got some of these different objects and I want to import in not all of them, but just some of them. So I can select the individual objects I want. I click the batch import option, and then it imports those objects into my library. I then open up my object settings. I then click the folders of each of these objects that it imported in. You can see where it's automatically created my preview right there for my object. And then if I go down to the Modelport panel there at the bottom of the object settings, there's a little open in Modelport editor button. I click that, and it automatically opens up into the Modelport preview window. So very fast, very quick, and I'm able to get these in. The other thing I want to point out here too is that if you've ever imported in external objects into ArchiCAD, you'll know that it doesn't create a preview as you see here automatically. What it does is it creates a little icon. In order to create that preview, I have to go and I have to place that object or select it in library, go open that object into the object editor in ArchiCAD. I then need to go and create a screenshot of whatever I want as that preview. I need to go back into the object editor. I need to go to the preview window button within that object editor, click that, go paste that, go save it. So you've got a lot of steps just to get that preview. And if you've got hundreds or dozens of objects you've imported, it can take a lot of time to do that. Modelport will automatically create that preview every time you bring in an object. And as I'll show you in a second, you can customize that preview as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were going to do a little comparison in speed between ArchiCAD and Modelport in terms of the time it takes to import and preview an object. I'm going to start with ArchiCAD first. So with ArchiCAD, in order to preview an object in the 3D window, I have to go through a bunch of different steps. The first step I have to go through is I need to go and select Merge from File, my File menu, and I need to go find that object. And then once I click that object to import, merge it into ArchiCAD, it'll start its spinning wheel, and depending upon how big that object is, it will take a couple seconds, it could take a minute, whatever it's going to take, depending on that object to import it. Once it's imported, it will then it will show on my cursor. And if I click the cursor in Plan, it will begin to place it in Plan. Now, when you do that, it still has to process. So now I'll start to do that SketchUp import export process in the plan view as it's starting to do its processing there. And then once it's processed, you then can fit the window to see what it looks like. In this case, you can see here, this is what the stove looks like in 2D, a little messy. I'm not so sure I want to import this object in now that I'm seeing it in 2D, but you know what? I'd like to see it in 3D too. So I'm going to go to the 3D window. Well, you go to the 3D window, now there's going to be more time to process that depending upon the complexity of that object. Then, once I get a 3D window, I want to be able to rotate around it, right? And it depends, again, that complexity of the object, because if it's a very complex object with a lot of polygons, it can be extremely sluggish in that 3D window. So this is what Modelport was created to kind of fix, is to really reduce that amount of time, because to go through these steps, as I kind of mentioned earlier, that object here is a very high polygon count object. And while you may think, oh, I don't import objects that are 700,000 polygons, there's actually a lot out there that people get access to quite often and want to use, things like trees and other things that can have real high polygon counts and can be detrimental to working within an ArchiCAD model. So it might not be this object, but I guarantee you, if you want to use a lot of trees and a lot of plants and things like that, it's going to be really helpful in ArchiCAD because we don't have a lot of great trees there. That's where it can really impact the performance in a very big way. And so this object is a great example where it took 2.5 minutes, as I mentioned earlier, in the Apple Silicon, 4 minutes, 10 seconds in the Apple Intel. Now, if I look at how the time took in Modelport, it took 11.21 seconds to import into Modelport. Now, why is that so much less? Well, first off, Modelport never has to place it in ArchiCAD, so it never actually uses ArchiCAD's environment and have to go through its set of however it does its processing. We've created our own processing that all happens within the Modelport environment. So let me show you this. This is actually step by step. I'm going to show you in real time here. You go to the Modelport menu. We're going to click Open 3D Model. We go find it. There's that Viking stove. You go open it. And now it's going to take us a couple seconds for that to process, no more than 11 seconds here. And it's going to open up that preview window and editor that is the Modelport environment. And here we are. And that's all it took. There's no, big problems here, very simple, very fast. What's also nice here is that I can edit, and it's not part of ArchiCAD until I click that Create button up there. So if I open this up, it took me 11 seconds to bring in this very complex object. I can say, okay, fine, I'm going to close that. I don't want this. And I never brought in ArchiCAD. I never cluttered my ArchiCAD model, and it never slowed down the performance of my model. So a much faster way, and it keeps your project clean and simple as well. Now, the other part that's really powerful about ModelPort is not just the preview window, but also the fact that you can edit in that same preview window. So for example, this is a pretty complicated model here, a lot of sophisticated curves and detail for this car. Now there's two methods that we can edit an object in ModelPort. One is by the object settings, and one is by the material settings. So those two options are at the top left of the screen. You can see just to the right of the Create button, the little blue cube is the Object button, and just to the right of that is four little icons, small dot icons together, and those are the materials. So if we use the object first, we can actually go into the item list, and we can select by item, so like the interior, the body, the glass, or we can go and select the tires individually. Or we can select any other elements that we want to select individually by simply clicking in that 3D window. If we want to edit by material, simply click the material button, as I mentioned there in the upper left. And then we're going to go over, and we're now going to select the item list for different materials, for the interiors, for my screens, or maybe I want to go over and select the body, and I want to change that material, or maybe I want to select the tire rims or the tires themselves. So again, it allows me to go in and have that interactivity to be able to change materials or to change components. And I'll show you what other ways that we can use this as well in a second. Now, one of the real powers of ModelPort, and one of the issues we have a lot of objects that we import into ArchiCAD, is that sometimes the objects don't look like what the preview was that was in the 3D warehouse or the manufacturer. If you ever downloaded objects from the 3D warehouse, you'll know that sometimes when you open them up, not only do they not look the same, they might contain things in that model that did not appear in the preview. This is a good example. This is a light. It was from 3D warehouse. It was this nice kind of schoolhouse light. Bring it in, and it just so happens that there's a rendering sitting inside of it. Well, that's great, but I don't want the rendering. I want the object. So yes, I could bring ArchiCAD. I could put it into the floor plan. I could right-click and convert it to a morph. I could then delete that in the floor plan within ArchiCAD. I could then select the elements again. I could then resave them as an object. But those are a lot of steps, and I'm also losing a lot in that transition. In ModelPort, what you do is you simply go in the ModelPort window, once it's in, I select the element, and I can go right-click the element over in the item list, and I can delete, or I can hide the element, either way. Now I've done. Now basically, I can go fit to window, I can start to edit this object, and I can also go and update the object. So once all this is done, I click update, and then you'll see that the green object over there on the left will now change. That goes away, and I can also update my object preview here on the right. Now, remember I mentioned about the preview that's automated in the object settings earlier. Well, sometimes that preview you may want to change along the way. Maybe you want it to be a little bit of a different view of that object. Well, there's a little option there in the library object properties that allows you to update and customize that preview. It's also important to be able to scale these objects. Sometimes these objects come in, whoever created it wasn't thinking about the true scale of the object, or maybe it was saved in some way that just didn't translate correctly. Maybe it was created metric, comes into ArchiCAD in inches. There's all kinds of reasons why we have these problems. So this lamp is a great example. This is actually from Lightolier. For whatever reason, even though it's a direct Lightolier object, it has this issue. So you'll notice that if I look at the width of this object, it's about 30 feet. Not quite what I think this object should be. So if we go and click on any one of these dimensions, they're interactive. So when I click on the dimension, a dialog comes up, And I can simply enter in that dimension. It resizes, rescales that object. Really simple. Go fit to window, we're done. And the nice thing about this is that particular process I just talked about, in other words, this interactivity of those blue dimension strings, is also the way that it works in various aspects of Modelport. So for example, up there in the upper left corner, import object right next to it, you'll see a little blue, the name of the object next to it, the Scott's Visual Comfort, I think it is. That is actually an interactive name. So if I click on that, a dialog will appear, and I can change the name there as well. And there's a multitude of other types of interactivity that's built into this environment using that same concept. Now, this is a nice little Lego person, probably not what you would use typically in your ArchiCAD projects, but I'm using this for a very good example. One of the things that's really important about bringing in objects from other sources is that they will not have parameters, okay? They're going to come in with the transform, the rotation, those kinds of parameters, but you're not going to be able to, take an element, individual element within the object, rotate it, move it, change it without exploding the object into a morph and doing it that way. And that becomes very cumbersome to do. So within Modelport, we do have the ability to quickly position or use, or I should say, change the position using XYZ, or change the rotation using XYZ. And this can be used together to actually change objects very quickly. So for example, if I select this leg, I can then select that. I can go to the position, Z, and I can move that forward. I can then go to the rotation, and I can rotate it backwards. So now that leg was not rotated originally, but now it is rotating. So let's say an example like a chair or something where you want to take an arm and you want to change its rotation or move it around, or the base of it. That gives you that ability and that flexibility to do something within that object that you would not have the ability to do if it was brought in directly into ArchiCAD. It's also important as we begin to work with these objects that we're able to edit them continuously throughout the process, okay? So when you place an object into ArchiCAD, a little pet palette will be available when you click that object. And in that pet palette is a button called MP, which you can kind of see here. If I click that MP button, it opens up the object into the Modelport settings, which I can start to edit at that point. And this is available for you in 2D and 3D environments as well as other views as well. And also, if you select an element and you open the object settings of that element, there's also a Modelport panel there at the bottom of the object settings. If you click the Open in Modelport Editor from there, it will also open that into the objects editor. So 2 ways that you can get to an object and edit it after it's imported. So the next topic I want to talk about is how you can manage imported models. This includes polygon counts, file reduction, and detail levels. So let's kind of talk about that next. So you remember I mentioned earlier that some of the things that is very common that a lot of users have struggled with, and that's trees and foliage and plants and bringing those kinds of things into ArchiCAD. And that's because in ArchiCAD, if we have a high polygon count object and we multiply that a lot, which we might with trees because we want to create a forest or a lot of trees in our site, it can really slow down the model. Now, the thing about ArchiCAD is I have something called the polygon reduction tool, and that allows me to reduce the polygon count of an object. In some objects, it can actually degrade the object so that in other words, with polygons, the higher the number of polygons, the higher quality of the object. The lower the number of polygons, typically, lower quality of the object. And in some objects, if I lower that number of polygons, I might see some degradation and the object might not look as good. There are other objects where if I do that, I'm not going to see that kind of change as much. This tree is a good example. In fact, a lot of trees and plants are good examples because you just don't see that kind of degradation on foliage as much because they're just natural. You're not going to see that kind of thing as much. So here you see that we've got a tree that is 1,122,291 polygons. That's a lot of polygons. And if I have a bunch of those in ArchiCAD, it's going to slow things down dramatically. However, I can take this tree and I can take a look at it, move it around, and when I'm ready, I can select it, go to the bottom of the screen, and I can select the poly reduced option. Once I do that, it will automatically reduce it by 2 decimation steps. Now I can reduce that by further to 3 decimation or 4 decimation, but you can see just with 2, which is the automatic reduction, it has reduced this by 82%. That is a huge reduction. So, I mean, this, if I needed a couple of these trees in my project and I want to bring those in, by being able to reduce that by 82% or maybe 90 or even 95%, if I reduce that even further, that's going to enable me to create that forest of those trees around my project with a lot more ease and a lot less issues of performance hit than if I didn't do that. The other issue we have in ArchiCAD is the ability to manage file size when you bring in imported objects. So, good example. This is a chair I kind of showed you earlier, has a lot of polygons to it. And when you bring it in, it's also a very high file size. Well, not huge file size, but about 13 megabytes. And that 13 megabytes actually can, if you have a bunch of objects like that, right, keep adding them up, it keeps bloating your file size. So the more that we can reduce those kinds of objects down, the better we're going to be. So let's look at how we can do that. So first off, in ModelPort, there are 3 save modes. There's ModelPort, which is our save mode within the application. There's GDL, that's the native format to ArchiCAD objects. And then there's GDL ModelPort, which is kind of uses those two together. So let's take a look at this particular object. So what we're going to do first is we're going to switch this to the GDL mode, and we're going to update this particular object. When we update this object, after we've changed it to GDL, which again is the ArchiCAD native format for objects, you'll notice that this object is 13 megabytes. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, that's not, it's not like enormous, but again, if we start adding a lot of objects, a lot of these chairs up in here that are similar, all of a sudden we could have 200, 500 megabytes of just objects in this file, it's not even including our project. So what we want to do is try to reduce this. And so if I now change this from the GDL mode to ModelPort, and I update this again, and then I go to my ArchiCAD settings here, and I open up that library manager, you'll see it's now been reduced to 2.2 megabytes in size. Huge difference, okay? That's, up to 8 times smaller is what we've seen on average. And so that is really significant. You start to have to deal again with a lot of objects to help keep those file sizes down, particularly if they're going to be embedded in your project. And then finally, I got something really fun to show you today. This is something new. This is something that's not currently in ModelPort that you're using today, or even in our demo that you would download today, but will be available very soon. What we've done is we've added in the ability now in ArchiCAD in ModelPort to be able to work with the model view options in ArchiCAD. Now, why this is important is because if you bring a model in from sources out there on the web or from manufacturers, there's a good chance that you're going to want to be able to control the detail level, because you may not want to see that full detail level as you can kind of see in this chair here in a document view. In a rendering view, yes. In a document view, no. So the ability to be able to save views and control that document level and customize that detail level is what we've done. So let me kind of show you how this works, and we'll take you through these steps. So first off, when you open up ModelPort and bring in an object, you have 3 buttons up at the top of the ModelPort window next to the detail level text. The first one is for detail or for full, and this gives you a detail level, right, of it. The next one in the middle is for simplified, which will simplify the view. And the third one is schematics. That one is really kind of blocky. It's kind of a more massing type model view. So that allows you to have three different variations, and then you can customize. This is a real important thing. You can customize this. This is what's really powerful in this new version. Not only can we say we can have a simplified version, we can customize it. So how does that work? So what we're going to do is we're going to select, first thing, we're going to select an element in Modelport, and we're going to assign it a detail level. So first thing I want to do is I want to select my detail level. I'm going to select simplified. Okay, so let's click the simplified button. That's the first thing it's going to do is it's going to reduce that polygon count level down. You can see where it just reduced that down by about 63%. And that's because clicking the simplified button will automatically apply polygon reduction to this element. Now, what you will notice is, remember I mentioned earlier that degradation can happen with elements. It depends on what it is. And with trees and foliage, you don't see that kind of thing, but with something like this, you do. You can see where the top edge of that chair around, you can see where it's kind of degraded a little bit, some around the detail of the edge of the chair as well. It's not quite as straight as it was before. In many cases, that might be just fine. You know, if you're doing this in a rendering where it's kind of at a distance, you may not see that kind of level. It may not be that big of an issue. What I'm going to show you here is how you can also keep the polygon count level high, so you can keep that quality of the element high, but at the same time turn off some elements that are actually creating this high polygon count. So what I mean by that is that if we look at this chair, and this is very common with objects, sometimes there's one or two or three elements within the object that are actually creating this high polygon count, that's creating this performance issue. So in this case, it's the arm of those chairs that has that sort of sculpturesque piece on it that kind of bends down, right? Those are the two elements that are creating all of the problems on this object. I mean, there are other elements that are too, but these are the primary parts of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go, first I'm going to select all, before I go in and select those elements, okay? First thing I want to do is I want to restore the chair's quality to the previous high quality, high polygon count level. So we're going to basically turn off the poly reduction here. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to select all my meshes, okay, in this simplified view, okay? And then I'm going to go down here to poly reduction. Now, in the poly reduction, I can choose, as I mentioned earlier, to decimate the steps as 2 or 3 or 4 or 1 or 0. In other words, I can control that up or down quite a bit either way. So as you'll kind of see here when I click next, it's going to go over here. We're going to go down first. You can see how it's really starting to decimate that. Now we're going to go up the other way, and it starts to get up to a higher quality. Okay, so now we're at a very high quality. So you're thinking, well, we're at a very high quality and we're in a simplified version of this. How are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the quality of the object, but we're going to turn off other elements that are creating the problems with the polygon count, problems with the performance issues. So now what we're going to do is we're going to select those arm elements I'm talking about, and we're going to hide those elements. So here we go. We're going to select those elements. We're now going to go down to where we do the polygon reduction. We're going to select hidden instead. When we select hidden, it's going to hide these elements, and that's going to reduce this down dramatically. So watch when we do this. We're going to click hidden, and now it has reduced that down quite a bit. You can see the reduction down now is at 16.4%, 6%. So we're at a 84% reduction. That's fantastic. I mean, you know, just to be able to do that very simple thing, to be able to keep this quality of the object, but reduce it down that dramatically. And I want to relay to you another good example. We were working with Graphisoft UK last summer, where they had a client who did a lot of manufacturing, and they had these manufacturing units and a lot of elements they were getting from Revit that were highly detailed, coming into ArchiCAD and creating high polygon counts. As they were wondering how they could actually manage this issue. Well, as it turns out, we were able to determine that there were a couple elements, like 2 or 3 of them, that they just need to hide or delete within the element, within the object. At that point in time, we didn't have this ability to be able to say that with a model view option. this is going to give them even more power to be able to manage it now, because before they had to delete those elements, right, and then create two versions of the object, one with the those elements off and the other with those elements on. But in this case, they could now use the detail level to simply take those elements, make them hidden on the simplified view, and that then reduces those elements to very low polygon count. So once we've done that, we can then go back to ArchiCAD. In ArchiCAD, we also have a full, a simplified, and a schematic option within our miscellaneous settings. So here, we're going to create two model view option combinations. One is going to be for detailed object view, where we're selecting full. And this is an example, right? You could also just do this in the other of the options here. And the other is simplified object view, where it's basically selecting the simplified version. And by doing that, we can then assign those model view options, right, to a view. So in this case, we create a view. Let's say we're going to call this view the rendering view, because we're going to use it for renderings. And the model view options you can see there in the middle, we're going to select the detailed object view model view option. Now, having done that, and then also we can create a separate second view called document view. In that document view, we're going to select the simplified object view as part of that. And by doing those two things and creating these two views, here's what happens. We now have the ability in ArchiCAD, separate from ModelPort, but because of ModelPort, to be able to manage this object in terms of simplified and detailed view. Now, this is a very simple interpretation of what this can do, but I hope this actually gives you, the opportunity for how you can now take imported objects and use that ability in ArchiCAD to be able to control detail level by model view options. So finally, how do you demo and get started with ArchiCAD? So if you go to our website, archvista.com/modelport, you can actually just go to once the web page comes up about ModelPort. If you go to the right-hand side, you'll see a menu there. And in that menu is an option called Download Demo. So all you need to do is just click that, and then you're going to have this web page appear. You enter in your email into our form here. Click Download Now. That will take you to a page where you can then download ModelPort for Mac or Windows, and for anything from 21 through 26 of ArchiCAD. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the model view options component is only for 23 to 26 of ArchiCAD. We try to get it to work for 21 and 22, but unfortunately it doesn't. But I think most people these days are typically on 23 to 26. If you're not, my apologies, but it doesn't work for those two versions. So with that, I think we're ready to start to take questions. Again, if you need to get a hold of us, you can also email us at info@archvista.com. And if you're in the US or anywhere for that matter, you can call us also at 800-522-0554. And let's go ahead and start to take questions. Let me review the questions in the panel here. Also, if you do have a question, just go ahead and enter those questions now. If you have not already done that, you just enter those into the question panel, and I will be able to answer those on my end. Let's take a look and see what we have.